All right.
Okay.
Go.
Go.
All right. So, of course, we had to come up with our giants are female, and I wanted to find someone that had a relationship with what the topic of our presentation is. So, Charity Majors is the CTO of Honeycomb.io, and it's probably an application that none of us are going to use because it's more for web apps. But what it was interesting to me is that she figured out what was the workflow that would allow web app developers be able to test in production. And when she figured out the workflow, she created the tools to make that possible. So she says that she tests in production because she has the tools to do it. And she says that you should be not afraid of releasing on Fridays. So if you want to learn more about her product and herself, she goes by Mipsy Tipsy on Twitter, and it's a good follow. All right, next thing. There we go. So who are we? The DSH Workshops stands for Delacorp, the SSDC, and Hampel Software, basically the companies that founded us. You probably already know me, but I go by Fab, as in fabulous and modest. I have to throw that away every time. It actually works when people come back and I'm like, did you say fantastic, amazing? I'm like, you keep going, you'll get there. One of the reasons we picked this topic was because it's part of chapter 7 on this book. I was supposed to do a book tour, but a pandemic got in the way.
Just skip that slide.
Okay. And then the DQMH Consortium. So Delacorp, we then donated the IP for DQMH to the DQMH Consortium. You can see the board of directors there. So if you see us around and you have any questions about DQMH Consortium, please stop by and check it out. The main thing was to ensure that it wasn't a single person or a single company that would keep this awesome tool alive. All right. The first slide and last slide of our presentation is the same thing. So if you want to follow Matthias' invitation and sleep throughout the whole presentation, the takeaway is you need a workflow. So if you want to go to sleep, that's the takeaway, right? All right. So some of the assumptions that we did here is you already know the importance of source code control, right? I don't have to convince you about that anymore. Even if you don't use one of the famous tools and everything, you have found a valuable replacement. If you don't use Git, SVN, Mercurial, any of those, you might want to stay away from me or have some backup if you come to talk to me. And if you want to learn more about that, I have a blog post and a presentation on every developer needs a time machine. And Joerg went and put that cross there. Every developer would benefit from a time machine. So we're trying to move away of being very dogmatic. And we hope that this presentation is going to do that.
Okay, so first of all, it's great to be here with all of you guys. I gotta say, I had a stressful summer, and on Wednesday at lunchtime, I was thinking about staying on my sofa instead of taking the train. But now I'm so happy that I didn't do that. So thanks for being here and thanks for having us. You know Fab and you know me, so this is not gonna be a presentation, it will be a conversation, and we created the slide set for posterity, so you can download it later, but we're not gonna present on it. So I'm gonna just rush through it to get to the case studies at the end and to have a conversation with you guys and have a discussion. I know some people who will speak up. Where are you, Sam? Not yet. No, not yet. Now's not the time. So with that being said, we want to talk about workflows. What is a workflow? Why do we think that developers would benefit from workflows? We'll show some examples and some findings, and then we'll talk about case studies. So if there's anything that you want to ask or comment on, please just blurt out and interrupt us at any time, but we are planning to have the discussion rather towards the end. Okay? Cool, yeah. What is a workflow? Suffice it to say, Wikipedia knows it, so go and read up on it. There's a lot of history to the topic, actually. It's a science. People have written books, and you know the names of Gantt, for example. You've definitely heard of TQM or Six Sigma. Probably you know that the industrialization and especially the automotive industry has played a huge role in coming up with better workflows. Toyota, like in the 80s. And of course, now in our knowledge era, workflows have become even more important. When we talk about a workflow, I just want to mention a few things that we should share so that we have a shared vocabulary. A workflow has elements. Usually these are processes that you then somehow put into sequence. You plan how they should work. And then on top of that, maybe add some flow control or scheduling to figure out what should happen. And if you look at the properties of a workflow, it can be modeled usually. It can be measured, which is important. And it can be automated, which is nice. The workflow itself probably is part of a larger thing, however you call that. So you have your workflow, and today we're talking about source code control workflows. There's an abundance of other workflows that you can have as well. And then you have your team, you have your infrastructure, you have your maybe IT department, whatever. So the workflow must fit into the whole thing, right? We call it our way of working. There are different names for that, really. What are the benefits of a workflow? To us, it's quite obvious. The first thing is when you think about your workflow, when you want to formalize that, you have to document it, right? So you sit down, you write down what you're doing. Maybe it's like kind of a checklist that you're taking down while you're doing stuff. And when you do that, you actually consciously think about what it is that you're doing. When you put it in writing, you have to think about how do I word it, how do I phrase it. So you end up with a list of all the things that you do and the sequence that they should happen in. That's good, because that's the basis, that's the foundation for the next steps. Because once you have written down what you're doing, you can start thinking about it and start optimizing it. So you can standardize and formalize tasks, which, as it says here, ensures repeatability and reproducible results. You also can identify bottlenecks maybe, or areas that are not optimal yet, so where you can do optimization. And then with that, you can improve your business operations, right? You can reduce your expenses, ideally, and you have a means of reacting very quickly to problems because you have already identified what should happen, and if you deviate from that, you have the means to react quite easily and quickly. A good workflow is the prerequisite for reproducibility.
Or repeatability,
yeah. And that can be automated, right? I mean, it sounds like the end goal, and I think it's a good goal to work towards. But even if you don't think about automation yet, it still makes sense to formalize, to standardize, to have everything reproducible. And if you then have time and budget and the interest, you can start automating stuff.
Now, some people say, I don't want to start automating, or I haven't started automating, or I haven't started building a separate computer because I don't have an automation. I haven't done continuous development, so I don't have a need for a workflow, or I don't have a need for documenting that workflow. So the idea is that you start already thinking that maybe in 5 years, 10 years, whichever is the timeline, you will get there. But in the meantime, having that checklist, that process that says, this is the way I do things, this is how I build things, means that you can have a manual. And like I tell some people that I coach, imagine having this binder that says, this is how we build an executable. And then you hire someone, and when they come in, you give them this binder and you tell them, I wrote this for you. I have been waiting for you. So I didn't have an employee for all these years. Maybe you're the first employee, but I have been preparing for you. When you're ready to automate it, you can say the team that's going to be in charge of doing that automation, look, I did this for you. This is how we do things. This is a checklist. And that was, I think, one of the biggest things that I realized when I went from just working with myself to working with teams, is I thought that the things that I was doing were common sense and were obvious. And then as you start working with other people, you realize that no, they're not. And there's not really a standard practice. And the fact that you document it and then you share it with your team and you tell your team, you know, your first job is, okay, I wrote this binder for you, but I really don't know you. We're just starting to get to know each other. So your first job is to document what we need to improve. So it's always a continuous improvement thing. So even if you're not using continuous integration, even if you're not building in a separate computer right now, I think is a good practice, even if you're working by yourself, is to start thinking, if I had to hire someone to help me, how would I get them up and running within like 2 days so I could really have them help me out, right? All right.
Workflows in software development. So now we're getting closer to what we're all interested in, I guess. When we're thinking about workflows in software development, probably the first most important question is how to pick the workflow. Which workflow do you choose? And we've collected a few bullet points questions here, which might be things to think about when you're considering which workflow to choose. And yeah, we're going to go through them right now, but not in detail, because I think it makes more fun to go back and look at them after looking at some case studies. Mm-hmm. But some things to consider are, do you know all the developers, first of all? So is it like a closed group or an open group? That's a big difference. Technically, that probably translates to, does everybody have write access to your repositories or not? Depending on that, you need to have a different workflow. How often should developers commit? That's a good question. How often do they commit? Where do they commit to? Are they allowed to commit broken code or not? And if so, everywhere, nowhere, somewhere. After they committed the broken code, how do you resolve conflicts? Or do you try to avoid conflicts in the first place? Do you need properly released code? Now, whatever properly released means. Probably like a proper version that has a name. And if you want to do that, where do you create that version? Where do you host that version? Where do you find that version later on? And do you want automate processes? Do you want to automate processes? And if so, which of those processes? There is an abundance of things that you can automate. We've put VI analyzer, unit tests, build pipelines here. When should they run? All the time, sometimes on like specific events or in specific places. And then some more. Is it necessary, or would you like for your team to be able to work in parallel? Do you need a process for handing over work results? That's now more like verging onto the management side of things. How do you keep an overview of who is working where or on what? How do you communicate with the team? Does that have anything to do with the workflow or not? Or do you want your workflow to integrate with the communication maybe? And then, of course, which tools to use. If you're free to pick, that's good for you. Sometimes your IT department dictates what to use. And like with George Orwell's Animal Farm, some animals are, what is it?
I don't know.
Some tools are better than others, betterer, and some are really not better than others in our experience. So that's an important thing to think about, because obviously if you can pick the tools in a way that they help you with your workflow, that makes your life easier, especially if they actually like nudge you or force you to like adhere to your workflow, then all the better.
If a tool is not helping you, it's an obstacle, it's not a tool. So. All right, so we were saying that we think that every team would benefit, and we need to go back and change the title of that one, would benefit from having a workflow. One thing that we want to put a disclaimer is we reserve the right to change our mind about which workflow is the one that we want to use. And I put the picture there of, I think it's a pretty good description of what happened in the last couple of years. Timeline is supposed to be aligned, but somehow when we got to March of 20 and then March of 2021, that's when I started saying last year, and people would tell me, no, that was 2 years ago. And then I think we should add a second circle there, because it's almost, I keep saying last year, and now it's 2 years ago. We were supposed to present this 2 years ago. We submitted the presentation 3 years ago. The book was coming out. We were different developers back then, and we had a lot more different opinions of what was the best workflow. Now, one of the things that we do at the SH workshops, whenever we do the workshops, and the idea we have of having different presenters with different experiences is that we've noticed that Steve, Brian, Joerg, and I may be implementing things very differently. We may be using very different tools. But when we start scratching at it, we agree on the foundation. And actually having submitted this presentation 3 years ago and presenting now, help us figure out what were those foundations. So we do agree that we need a workflow. I had to come up with one of my Mexican sayings, cuentas claras, amistades largas. And Matthias, how is it in French? Les bons comptes font des bons amis. It roughly translates to clear accounting, long-lasting friendships. So you want to make sure that everybody knows if I loan you money, when you're going to pay me and all that stuff. The same thing happens with the workflow. If we all agree that this is the way we're going to do things, your discussions and debates are going to be about the important stuff, how to solve the problem, not the fact that you didn't do your commit or you didn't put the commit note or you didn't do a branch. Like that type of stuff, we shouldn't be spending time on those things. So we think that a clear workflow is going to contribute to a harmonious work relationship. See, we're all about making your life better.
Very well.
Okay, so how to pick a workflow? You can create your own workflows. You could either take an existing one or you can do a mix of both. So one of the things we say is first go back to all the considerations that we listed. Talk to your team. If you are kind of debating or if you are one of those companies that's working with customers and you have tried different workflows depending on the customer you're working with, get together and decide what is the one that we're going to push forward and we're going to try to do from now on. Now, the two workflows that we're talking about here is going to be trunk-based development and gitflow. There's a lot more, but we chose to focus on those two. Find a workflow that doesn't break your flow, right? You want something that lets you go with the flow. You want something that guides you in the right direction. It's not an obstacle. It just makes your work and your life better. Okay. Don't yuck somebody else's yum. I think I need to translate that. Like yum means when something is really, really delicious, and yuck is like if I'm eating something that I think is great. Like when I was a kid, I came up with this idea of a sandwich of tomatoes with strawberry jam, and I really liked it. And everybody would look at me like, yuck. So don't go yucking someone else's yum. Not because they're a workflow that works for others, but it annoys you, means that you have to go tell that team how to do their thing, right? You can suggest they have you try or thought about these things. They may not know about it. But if it's working for them, if they're getting work done, releasing stuff, then don't go yucking it. We good? Okay. So, examples of workflows.
So interestingly, I will have to make up for all the time that you yapped away now. So I'll go fast. We picked, I think, two extremes, a very simple workflow and one that's said to be quite complex. So the one that we call trunk-based development really means that they have a single branch, which is used to be called the trunk in SVN, which nowadays, if you use Git or whatever, is called differently. So it's also called mainline-based development, maybe. And it means that you have a single path in your source code control. So a single line of advancement, of evolvement in your development. Anything that you change on your code will go into that single path of evolution. So it's a sequential model. There's really nothing that you can screw up in terms of like the sequentiality of your commits. It's just one after the other. You can move backwards and forwards again, but you cannot deviate. So that's very clear. People who use this workflow and who are very happy with it claim that it is superior to other workflows because of its simplicity. Taking from the website that we had on the previous slide, it does say here, I'm going to read it, you should do trunk-based development instead of gitflow. And that alone is a very bold statement, but let's take it. Instead of gitflow and other branching models that feature multiple long-running branches. Okay, so you should do that, okay? You can either do a direct to trunk commit push, small teams, or a pull request workflow, as long as those feature branches, which feature branches I'm asking, because we're in mainline, right? As long as those feature branches are short-lived and the product of a single person. Okay. So if you scroll further down that website, and now I'm being a little funny, it becomes more funny, because this is what you find there. This is only the top of the list. So
you can keep scrolling with all the caveats.
you can keep scrolling. You should, like, depending on team size and rate of commits, short-lived feature branches are used for code review, and it goes on and on. You should, like, reduce release branches maybe, releasing from trunk or not, branch by abstraction I can see here, and other things. And I'm not really meaning to yuck anybody's yum. I really want to stress and point out and highlight that it's not as simple as it seems on the surface. And it's not as simple as people want to make it seem. Because even if you have like a simple model, you run into real life problems still that you need to find ways to work around.
You still need to put the rules of engagement.
Yeah.
You still have to tell people what to do.
So this is not the panacea it's made out to be sometimes. Summary, a single shared branch that acts as the current state of the product. It's a simple concept. It's always deployment ready. But that's a big question mark there as well, because if you commit something that should not be deployed, you've got a problem, right? It does say here it's risky without proper testing structure. So usually, maybe also in other programming languages and environments, you would set up a system that makes sure that whenever you commit something, everything is good. So you run your tests, you make sure everything builds all right, etc., etc. If you have all of that in place, then I think it's a safe place to operate. If you don't have that high level of automation and confidence, it's like there be dragons, I guess, in that thing. And the last thing I think is important for the understanding, it works best for non-monolithic software. Think website, not app. So if you're thinking about the website of a bank, for example, they have all sorts of widgets and gadgets, and they have the tax things and the stock course and then whatever. So they can update all of these little things all the time and you won't even notice. They don't need to roll out like a release to you that you need to download and install or whatever. So that's really where continuous integration can shine. If I'm thinking about our customers, and I think it applies to most of the people here in the room, it's not as simple as sending a new EXE like 10 times a day to our customer. He will give us the bird. So,
especially when there's hardware involved. I don't know which of our customers will let us deploy an executable without ever having tested with hardware.
Yeah. So this takes us to the other extreme. Let's call it the other extreme, gitflow. Quick show of hands, who is familiar with gitflow? Very good. Thank you.
And how many are familiar with trunk-based development? Okay, who uses gitflow? And who uses trunk-based development? It's not as clear-cut as I thought it was going to be.
There's so many people we can go home, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. So I won't go into the specifics of gitflow now, but as I said, it's the other extreme. So you have a mental model of how you should work, and this dictates quite a few things. If you look at the graph again, we can see we have all sorts of branches, and they are connected in specific ways. You need to go from here to here, and then you need to go back there, and if you want to release, you go through here to there. So this seems complex, and it is more complex than not having a lot of branches. Of course it is more complex. In my opinion, that is not an argument to discard the model, because it solves other problems that are not visible here on this chart. This looks more complex, but then again it solves other problems, right? So a branch-based workflow, as it says here in the summary, additional types of branches kept up to date with mainline, feature branches and integration branches. It allows for parallel development. I think that's an important one. You can have your deployment-ready code in specific places, but not everything has to be deployable, right? You have areas where you can park code that's just not ready yet for production. And written in red, we can see maintenance of feature branches adds overhead, definitely. You need to keep things in sync. You need to stay on top of what you're doing. You need to have certain sequences of doing things so that you don't create conflicts with yourself or with team members. So it does have lots of overhead, especially for new developers who are not familiar with that thing. It is not continuous by definition. What does that mean?
No,
I think the next slide says it better.
No, I think you were in the branch-based workflow, and then I pushed you to.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Anyhow, the message is clear. What are the findings? Some basic building blocks are hard, probably hard requirements. I think we need source code control. There's no way around that, especially if we're talking about workflows for source code control. It would be good to have a separate machine to build on, be it a build server or just another PC. So that's just good practice. Obviously, if you have a style guide or a description of the workflow, that helps if you're working in teams and not on your own. We already said that you should choose the tools accordingly. And at the end, just decide as a team what works for you. I think that's the most important thing, because like eventually, it's always the people who needs to be accommodated. It's about making life easier for the people, right? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't help if you have the most sophisticated workflow if nobody can use it. So it needs to fit the team. And then last thing, most workflows are similar. Differences are more a gray area in real life, and that's also what we saw with the few screenshots where it said, okay, trunk-based, you only have the single branch, but then they start talking about feature branches. And for gitflow, you can do the same thing, really, where you say, we do have feature branches, but we need to have some rules in place to say they shouldn't be too long-lived or not too many, only one per developer, whatever your system is. So it meets in the middle.
So the main thing is communicate. There has to be communication. We've always said this, doesn't matter what tool you choose, it's never going to be a replacement for communication, right? All right, so some of the case studies. Single developer project. The background for this one, we started working with this team in 2009. It was one developer, sometimes works with a contractor whenever that happens, is body programming, so there's never two people touching the code separately. It's always either a single person or multiple person, they're all working with a single computer. The repository needs to be stored inside a firewall. No services provided by the company IT. Code is developed in one building but gets tested and deployed at a separate building. Both buildings are within the firewall. So what would you recommend? Trunk-based development or gitflow?
Hands up for trunk-based.
Okay, and for gitflow? And all the other people that you're taking a nap, or was it? Okay, again, okay. Trunk-based development. Okay, and gitflow? Yeah, half of the room is asleep. Okay, so.
I don't have enough information there, Fab. I don't know anything about the developer.
So, SVN trunk-based development, we started in 2009. So back then, the community was all about SVN. So this particular developer went from not having anything to wanting to have some source code control. So we started with SVN. We used Tortoise SVN, and we used the Viewpoint SVN project provider, right? The repository resides in a shared folder that gets backed up by IT nightly, so we didn't have to worry about the backup. The developer checks out code both at the development building and then at the test deployment building. The releases are tagged. No problem with committing broken code, because since he's only himself, he could just leave for the day, commit everything he had done, and it didn't matter if the code was broken or not. And the rule was that he needed to commit multiple times per day. So where are they now? They're still using SVN trunk-based development. They're still using Tortoise SVN directly on the Windows Explorer. They moved away from the Viewpoint project provider because it turns out that once we upgraded to the newer versions of LabVIEW, if you wanted to have the overlay images on the project, if that was on in the settings, that would crash LabVIEW pretty frequently. So it got to the point where, okay, we turn it off, but then we lose the use of having the overlay images. So the decision was made, we're still going to be using SVN, but we'll do everything directly on Windows Explorer. We won't have any tail work working with the project. There's no changes. SVN does the trick. There was really no reason for somebody that works really very deep in LabVIEW for about 2 weeks a year, and then he doesn't touch the code until somebody comes and asks for another feature. So really, it was no need to go too crazy on a tool that would do a lot more. The other thing is, even though we were not doing anything fancy, we were not doing the latest and greatest, it still led to repeated business. We're still working with that customer, and that customer still recommends our work to other people. So we must have done something right. The multiple developer...
There's a question?
Oh, there was a question?
So the question was, if we had the customer now, would we do the same thing all over again?
So I would still probably, the thing here is there's no support from IT. We're talking about a single person, again, that works really heavy on the code. I think I would still suggest SVN, because I don't want this person to have to deal with anything that has to do deploying a whole instance of Git for them. And again, it's like it's a single person. If there was a team, I would push them more towards Git, and we would go with gitflow. What's up, Sam?
Oh, I have a question just related to that. So since the guy didn't have any IT support, how was he like sharing it between the two computers? Was it just like on a shared drive? Was
Well, yeah, that's
folder?
why. Yeah,
Okay,
the
was a
thing
quick
is in a
question.
shared drive, and it just because it is on a shared drive, is automatically backed up by IT. And the other thing is that it can also be accessed by other team members. It's not. It's in a public to the company shared drive. All right. Okay. So next. This one is multiple developer project. Now, in this one, we have security clearance issues. So we started working with them around 2015. There were 3 in-house developers, up to 5 contractors with different levels of security clearance. Company can host the repository. So what would you recommend? Trunk-based development or gitflow? So let's see, hands for trunk-based development. Okay, so we have 3 people for trunk-based development. How many for gitflow? Okay, most of the room. A lot of people woke up. Okay, so what did they decide? Okay, the red is the part that I wasn't really too happy with, but this is the thing about being a coach. You try to guide them on the right direction, but at the end, you have to be okay with letting the team do what they decide was best for them. So what they went with was multiple repositories using HG. That one, I have to admit, it was my bad coaching. I was betting on the wrong horse, and HG kind of went away, and Git is still around. But they went with HG trunk-based development. Code shared via VIPM packages for anything that was released, so there were multiple repositories. The application repository that was accessed by the inside architect, that was the master repository, had all the other repositories as sub-repositories. Now, here's the crazy thing. Contractors had access to a select number of repositories, but instead of giving them access to the same repository that the main architect had access to, they were given access to a mirror repository. Okay, so that meant that the main architect, anytime the contractors were done, would then copy the contents of that repository and paste them on the internal repository. So that led to having some repositories that had a postfix RC. And I see everybody shrinking. Yeah, it was like, and of course now that we've been working more with this, if we had used multiple remotes, which can be done, you could still have a mirror repository that's in a different service. And then you go to your tool, if you're using Fork, for example, and you say, okay, I want to connect to the other repository, pull from that repository, now I connect to my internal one, and now I push on my internal one. So there's a way of doing this without this craziness that we have here. Only employees with highest security clearance build VIPM packages and executables. The main rule was we do not commit broken code to main. If the developer cannot get working code by the end of the day, that was the only place where creating a branch was accepted. Like if you think that it's going to take you a lot longer to work on the code that you were working. And the way we knew what code was released was using tagging the code. All right, so where are they now? So now they're using multiple repositories using Git and gitflow. So the code is shared still with BI package manager. We have an application repository that has all the repositories and submodules. Contractors have access just to a select number of repositories. And now there's no more copying and stuff. It's just going to the repositories. Only employees with highest security clearance build, like everything else is the same. This one also led to repeated business and recommendations to other customers. So why did they change? The main igniter for change was they were using Atlassian, and Bitbucket announced that they were not going to support HG anymore. So that was the thing to say, okay, we're going to move to Git. And we talked to the team. What's working? What needs improvement? And what do you think everybody said? That crazy thing about having two repositories is just nuts. We need to remove away from that. And the other problem was the trunk-based development was leading to when we wanted to do a new release, we never really knew what had the last working version for everything. So we moved to Git. The other thing was we were ready for doing continuous integration and continuous development. If we wanted to keep with the trunk-based development, we needed to do a bunch of things about learning tags or commit things that we would put into brackets to tell the pipelines when to do things. But if we moved to gitflow, then it was really, I'm not going to say easy because nothing is easy, right, Olivia? But it's more straightforward, like with a tool like GitLab, to say when I merge from a feature to develop, trigger running unit tests, trigger running the analyzer. When I merge my release, trigger building an executable, right? So you can decide what you tell the continuous integration. And I think the reflection, or what I want you to take away from this, is the fact that writing down what our workflow had so many steps, that should have been a big alarm that automating it was going to be difficult. If I can do a diagram and show you, this is when I'm going to trigger running unit tests, this is when I'm going to trigger this thing, you have a sense that then automating it later is going to be more straightforward. So your case study?
Yeah, just probably only a quick addition to that. This is how we are approaching most of our projects, most of our work, all of our internal work, and with most of our customers, and especially with the 2 or 3 largest of our customers. And with this one, we started working in around 2015. It's an ongoing collaboration. We're working on different projects with them. They have 4 in-house developers. I think they started with 2 back in 2015. And depending on the workload, 1 to 4 of us are helping them get the work done. It's a real-time and FPGA-based test system with Windows, monitoring and control clients. The company does have an in-house GitLab server, which they have to use, which I liked a lot, of course. And they have the traditional manual rollout of new releases for the software. So nothing that's really continuous in that regard. So what do you think that we went with? Tough question.
Hands for trunk-based development?
No, what do you think we went with?
And gitflow? Yeah, I think they're catching up with the trend here. Okay.
So obviously we went with gitflow. We started out with Git and GitLab, as was dictated by their IT. We started introducing Git submodules to them, and that was kind of a... it took up more speed.
Not a nice experience.
No, it started out nice, and then they started using it for everything and more. And at some point it becomes a nuisance, and then it becomes really slow and tedious. So I think there's a middle ground somewhere when using submodules. It's my takeaway. Gitflow, as I said, for features and releases. Maybe the occasional hotfix, but I think that's not really the case. We ended up using Gitfork as a client because it integrates so well, or it helps so well integrating Gitflow into your work. That's really a nice user experience for us. And on top of that, we use the issue tracking of GitLab for our work planning. So we create issues, we assign issues, then we create the feature branches from the issues with a certain branch naming system, etc. And for us externals, we are not able to access the machines to test the code. So we agreed that we create merge requests for the internal developers. They will then test the software on the machine and only then finalize the merging back of the feature. And yeah, where are they now? Oops, that's the wrong. This one I meant, of course. So I can honestly say that it's working very, very well for us. I have no reason at all to change anything in our workflow. So my yum is very yummy.
And one of the things I wanted to point out is the Git fork was the main thing that made the transition for the security clearance team to work. Because when we were using source tree, even though we downloaded a gitflow plugin for it, it was a pain. It was so easy to end up with headless branches. When we moved to using the fork client, even the most, you say that, strange opponents said, yes, you're right. If you have the right tools, I can totally get with this. And they're custom tools that you can create. Yeah, there's actually some, for that one, you can trigger things like applying the IPCs and before you build packages and prepare your branch to be released, so the developer doesn't need to remember all the things on the checklist. And you can add those plugins to your own instance of fork. If you want to know more about that, Matthias is the person to talk to. So what happens when you pick an existing workflow and then you make it your own? That is on the book, that picture there. I don't know if Paul is over there, so he can tell you if they're still doing that or not. I should have asked you before showing the image. But the thing I like about this image is it shows where is it that they use the different configuration files for BI Analyzer. And the crosses, green cross means all the unit tests pass, red means everything is failing, and then the orange is we're starting to have a mix of both passing. And you can see that the idea, or what we're looking for, is everything that's on the development branch always passes all the unit tests. And then we have a release branch. So, like we said, you need a workflow. That's the takeaway.
60 seconds for questions.
Yeah.
No time for that, no time for that. This is the first time that we're ending before our time is over, so let's use that.
I have some very quick questions, actually. First one, how often do you revisit the workflow decision, and what might trigger that?
Yeah. So the thing on our, or how I coach teams to work is you have weekly meetings where you're always asking 3 questions. What's working, what needs improvement, and what was your highlight of the week? You start knowing that your workflow needs revisiting when every single week you're getting everybody telling you, Fab, that crazy thing with the underscore and RC thing and having to paste, that's like the worst thing ever. You're like, okay, we really, really need to work with the customer here because this is really not working. So it was the final decision maker on the customer side that was saying, this is how we're going to do it. It was me having like, okay, for the last 5 weeks or for the last month and a half, this is the #1 complaint I have from every single developer in the team. This is not working. We need to really revisit. So it's always checking. There are going to be things on your workflow that are more straightforward to fix. Like, for example, on the BI Analyzer test that I was showing. This is another thing about BI Analyzer tests. If you're setting your continuous integration, continuous development to ignore BI Analyzer test results, don't run the BI Analyzer test results. Why are you running BI Analyzer? It really should break your build. If it's annoying you that it's breaking your build a lot, then it's time to revisit as part of your workflow, what are the BI Analyzer tests that you run at each step. So I think you should be going back and changing your configuration and ignoring some of the tests, as opposed to set your pipeline to ignore the results of the. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answered my first question. I have 2 more. But we got a minute. So I think we've all had the experience where you want to make some big changes or refactoring, so you create a branch and you start doing it, and then it takes longer than you thought, and then at some point the trunk or the main branch is diverged so far that then when you go to merge back in, it either never gets merged or it's just completely merged out. So how do you encourage or do you have a plan to like keep that?
The feature branches should be short-lived. Like you shouldn't be having if a branch, and we have this with the security clearance team. They have a branch that has been alive for 2 years. Yep. Right now it's just more for historical information. That will never be merged back. It has good information on exploration of things that were done, and that's why it hasn't been deleted, because it still has useful information, but it will be totally fool's errand to try to measure that.
Okay. One last question. In the very beginning, you mentioned working in parallel, but then you didn't really say anything else about that. Do you guys have any experience with like pair programming, mob programming, and how does that fit in? And how does that
I
work with
mentioned
GitFlow?
the single developer example was anytime
you
he
did say
touches
pair
the code
programming.
with other developers, it's always a single keyboard, single mouse. So, but you want to talk about that? The part
I want to say that I don't think that branches need to be short-lived. I don't believe in that at all.
But what is the definition of short?
Yeah, that's the first question. What is short anyhow?
So for us, it's whatever is sprint duration. So if your next iteration for giving a release for a customer is 2 weeks, your feature branches should not leave more than those 2 weeks.
I think that's not realistic in our
But,
life.
but I
gotta
also,
say.
yeah, no,
You got to make sure that you update your featured branch with the latest contents of developed, for example. So there needs to be and we created a tool for our customers that automatically pulls all the branches of all the repos from the server and creates an HTML page and highlights with the color coding how old or how long-lived are the branches, so we can go through that once every week
Well, and
and
this
see
is-
what are the branches that are bound to be stale. So we have we stay on top of that. But I think they can be long-lived if you put in the extra work for synchronizing, for keeping them up to
I
date.
think we would need to highlight here that something that you do different. The way we're showing here is the code review, that thick red thing is reviewing the code and having all the unit tests pass and then merging to develop. What Joerg does is they take, at that step, they merge develop into the feature. And then they make sure
From here to here.
yeah,
From
so
here
they
to
go
here.
back in this direction to make sure, A, did I break anything on develop? Fix anything that they broke on the feature branch. And then when they're ready, they push it back to develop.
And I'm
So
not
that's
saying,
an interesting
I'm not saying
approach.
that it's ideal, but it's. I think it works perfectly well for us to keep us going. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, my question is actually a continuation on this. Let's say you have quite a few competences within your team. So maybe if you have a feature branch and you break something, you want to merge it, you break something from another feature branch, how would you resolve that? That conflict that would result from.
So I guess the background here is we work on using DQMH, so our development is modular development approach. So most of the time, a feature will be touching one, maybe two modules. So it's more maybe 1-2 developers. So the chances of breaking another feature branch in a single sprint, it would be really weird because you normally because you're modularizing things, it's normally your feature only touches these modules. Now, the situation where that doesn't pan out is library files, project files, because normally those are the ones that you may have, even though you're modularizing, you may have conflicts. So the approach we've taken is you pick who's the owner for that sprint, who owns the project and who owns the project library or who owns the class library. And if there's a conflict, if the owner is the one that discovers the conflict, we have all agreed that they can just discard the other person's changes because they're the owner. And then they can just send a message, say, hey, I don't know what you did there, but you have to go fix it. There were conflict and I just choose mine and I didn't make your, if the other person is the owner, if the person that finds the conflict is the other person, they have to go talk. So it's again the whole thing about communication.
Yeah,
But
I
it
want to
does,
say that
yeah.
too. First, it's communication. It's always small teams. We have our weekly rounds. So I think an unexpected conflict is very rare. I think, honestly, I can count them on one hand. And if it's an expected one, you have the strategy beforehand, actually. So if there's some very important thing that needs to be done, you will say, listen, I got to take over. Either I capture your branch or whatever, but it's an anticipated thing, so the solution is probably not too hard.
And then the other thing that Fork has that makes it really easy is you can stash things. So if you start staging and you realize that you have all these conflicts, you can just basically say, okay, I'm going to stash all the changes that I did. I'll do my commit. And then I'm going to call the other developers. Can we sit together? Because there's enough things that I think we need to work together to fix it, as opposed to try to guess. In my case, I work with a lot of teams that are not co-located, so that makes it a little bit harder, because you may have someone working in Australia and the other person working in the US. The time that we have to meet together and solve those things is more rare, so we have a lot more guidance as to how you can make the decision when you know that the other developer is 3 in the morning and they're not going to be able to help you out. So that's the other thing to keep in mind.
So communication is a key, and we need to have a workflow. Not everybody is in good position to have a coach who will help you. So usually it is a team that needs to work out what the workflow will be. You said that they are very similar things, and what are the differences is the great stuff. So my question here will be, what are your 3 best advices to steer out of those religious discussions and those religious wars about the tiny differences to help facilitate the team to get a good decision?
So, you want to take that one? Go ahead.
The three nuggets, the 3 golden nuggets, I would say first, the team needs to be involved in the decision making, if not actively, at least passively, so everybody needs to understand why things are happening and why decisions are made. So it is much easier to go with something when you explain it to everybody and they understand why and they can learn it, as opposed to rolling out a new process and nobody knows really why. So the first thing is to involve everybody.
So I was going to say 3 things. Well, you're going to have access to the slides, so go back to the considerations and make sure that as a team you answer all those questions. I think it was 12 in 2 pages. So you just go back to the considerations, discuss them with the team. If you have access to this book, if you don't want to buy it, just call your library and tell them there's interlibrary. This whole section, chapter 7, talks about working with teams and not you. So there's enough, I'm not going to say I have all the answers, but I have enough pointers that you can go check. And what else I was going to say?
Number 3.
Yeah, number 3.
So number 1 was talk to your team. Number 2 was buy the book.
Go to the library and get it.
I guess number 3 is as simple as possible and as complex as necessary, as always.
Oh, the finding the right tools. The reason I was kind of like fast forward, we totally thought that Sam was going to bring this thing, but he didn't. So I'm going to do. A lot of people say the guy that wrote gitflow is the first one to say don't use gitflow anymore, but they always fail to say how he phrased it. And so I recommend you go to see it, but basically what he says is when he wrote gitflow was 10 years ago, the type of applications that he was working on were more like the applications that we work on, which is there's version, we never release really without testing first. And I think it's the next one, right, that he says, is it on the next slide? This is the class of software that I had in mind when I wrote the blog post 10 years ago. If your team is doing continuous delivery of software, I would suggest to adopt the most simple thing, right? Instead of trying to do GitHub, which says GitHub flow. But if you're building software that is explicitly versioned, or if you need to support multiple versions of your software in the wild, then GitFlow may still be as good of a fit for your team as it has been for the last 10 years. So this is the caveat that when people start getting into religious discussions, they forget to mention. Are you doing web apps where you're releasing automatically to the production server, or are you doing version applications? So that's another good thing to keep in mind.
Thank you. Okay, guys,
Darren Mather is not here, so who's going to drag us off today?
Who's going to drag me off like I did?
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.